Absolutely. So this is a really, really interesting Mishnah. Mishnah Yud Zayin, Pirkei Mishnah Yud Zayin, 17th Mishnah of the 5th chapter. What we are learning today, in conjunction with what we learned in the previous Mishnah, is that love is not always good. That was the previous Mishnah. And conflict is not always bad. That's this Mishnah. It's so interesting because people naturally assume love is positive and conflict is negative. But this is exactly what we're learning over here. It doesn't always work that way. Now, what we're going to learn about conflict in this Mishnah is so profound that it should radically shift how we approach many, many, many things in life. Let's look at the Mishnah. Let's see what kind of questions you may have on the Mishnah. And then based on that, we'll put all the pieces together. The Mishnah starts by saying, Kol machloikes shehi l'shem shamayim soifa lehiskayim. Can anybody please tell me what that means? Kol machloikes, any conflict, debate, argument, shehi l'shem shamayim, which is for the sake of heaven, soifa lehiskayim. What does that mean? In the end. Soifa. At the end, it will endure. Okay, I don't know about you, but I have a couple of questions on this line. Right? Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. And if it is not for the sake of heaven, then ein soifa lehiskayim. How do you translate that? In the end, it won't endure. Okay, so we've got to work out what this expression is, in the end. What do we mean by in the end? Okay, but then the Mishnah gives us examples. Now, we have learned about different types of character. We've learned about different kinds of students. We've learned about different types of people in their attitude to giving tzedakah, to going to the base medrash, and different kinds of minds that can absorb information. And for none of those did the Mishnah feel that it had to give us an example. Until we got to love. In the previous Mishnah, when we spoke about love that is or isn't appropriate, then for the first time the Mishnah gave us examples. Here too, for conflict, the Mishnah is going to give us examples. So, what is an example of an argument, debate, or conflict that is for the sake of heaven? Zoi machloikas Hillel v'Shammai. The debates between Hillel and Shammai. I have a big question on this. Maybe you do too. Let's see. What's an example of a debate, conflict that is not for the sake of heaven? Korach v'chol adosai. Korach and his entire assembly. Right. How many questions do you have on this Mishnah?
Why only in the end?
Why only in the end? Why do we talk about how the conflict that is l'shem shamayim will endure in the end? And the one that is not l'shem shamayim will not endure in the end. What's this in the end that we speak of? Okay, what else?
Well, I think Shema is not completely, or maybe it is in the end, because we follow Hillel now.
Okay, good question. Let's develop that question. Hillel and Shammai, does the argument endure? That we have halachas, and we know that the halacha follows Hillel in just about every single case. But okay, he's saying when Mashiach comes, then we'll follow Shammai. Good point. Okay, so maybe that's the end. Either way, we're going to follow one opinion. What does it mean that the argument will endure? You know, there's a cynical take on this Mishnah. The cynical take is when people believe that their arguments are for the sake of heaven, that's when they perpetuate the argument. They're not willing to let go. So, okay, we've got to see if that's the case of Hillel and Shammai. What are we going to say? Oh, look at this. Hillel and Shammai, not base Hillel and base Shammai, but the two individuals, Hillel and Shammai, versus Korach, where it's Korach and all of his followers. Okay? Can we start with a very basic question? Surely, machloikas cannot be l'shem shamayim by definition. Surely. In other words, what's machloikas? The most direct translation of the word machloikas is actually division. And when's the first time that machloikas ever happened?
Gan Eden.
Before Gan Eden. When? Before that. Not heaven and earth? But when Hashem splits, Hashem creates machlokas on the second day of creation. It's a machlokas between the higher and the lower waters. That's how the Torah describes it. And it's so bad that Hashem will not say ki tov. Because it's a negative thing. Machlokas is a negative thing. By the way, if you've ever looked at the beginning of Parshas Korach, where it says, Vayikach Korach, Korach took his group of people, Onkelos translates the word Vayikach in a very revolutionary way. He does not translate it to mean take. He translates it as Ve'es Paleg Korach, which means Korach caused a division. Based on that, there's an entire interpretation in the Medrash that says that Korach's division mirrored the division that happened on the second day of creation. So how can there be machloikas l'shem shamayim? Surely the whole purpose of being connected to Hashem, that's l'shem shamayim, right? For the sake of heaven, is all about unity. Hashem echad. So how is it possible? And all of the commentators on the Mishnah ask this question. How is it possible that we could use the word machloikas in the same context as something which is for the sake of heaven? It's totally self-contradictory. So that's the overarching question that we have to examine in this particular discussion, in this particular Mishnah. Hashem is oneness. Machloikas is an absence of godliness. That's why there is conflict. How then can there be a machloikas for the sake of heaven?
It's not debate, more than machlokas.
Well, I don't know. The word is machloikas, right? The Mishnah uses the word machloikas, which is division, right? So how can there be division that is directed towards Hashem? It should be unity that is directed towards Hashem. That's why I say this is such a profound Mishnah. Okay, any other questions?
But Hashem is the one that did the first division.
Hashem created the first division and then said that this is no good, implying that division is not a good thing. Maybe it's a necessary thing at certain points in history, but it's not a good thing.
If it's L'Shem Shamayim, why is it so for this guy? And do we want it to come to an end? Do we want to know what
the resolution is? Exactly. So why is it so Philiskayim? Why do you want the machloikas to continue? Surely you don't want the machloikas to continue. You actually want to have the resolution, right? Okay, good. Any other questions?
Maybe the different aspects of the truth.
Oh, good. That's a really interesting point. Different aspects of the truth. So we're going to examine that. That's a very insightful point, that perhaps there's different angles or perspectives on the truth. Okay, we'll come back to that. Another question for you. Out of all of the debates that we have in the entire Mishnah and Gemara, is it only Hillel and Shammai that debated L'Shem Shamayim? Whoa, this is a little insulting, don't you think, to everybody else? The fact that the Mishnah only chooses Hillel and Shammai as the example. Why them? Why not everybody else? That's an interesting question. Korach we get. We understand why Korach is the prime example of a machlokas that is not for the sake of heaven. We get that. But why then does the Mishnah say Korach v'chol adasai? Korach and all of his followers. Why doesn't it just say, like it normally says in most references, Korach va'adasai? Korach and his followers. What's the emphasis over here on kol adasai? All of his followers. Okay, so these are some of the things that we have to examine in this Mishnah to try and understand what's going on over here. There are quite a number of different suggestions that are put forward. Most of them effectively coalesce into one overarching principle, which is that you'll notice, we're not deciding in this Mishnah whether the protagonists or antagonists, depending how you want to call them, in the argument are going to endure. We're talking about whether the argument is going to endure. So Hillel and Shammai, it's not a question of whether or not they would survive the conflict, but with Korach it's pretty clear that he did not survive the conflict. So that's not really what the Mishnah is trying to distinguish over here between who will or won't survive in the long term, but it's rather in terms of whose teachings will survive in the long term. Now, one of the interesting observations that a number of the Meforshim make is this. Life is not black and white, and there is always a range of experiences that people could have. And that range of experience goes from absolute L'Shem Shamayim, which is where a person's debate is absolutely void of any sense of self. They're just trying to clarify what the halacha is. That's the ideal. That's the ideal kind of a debate. Why are we debating? Because we want to know the truth. And the only way we're going to get the truth is we're going to fight it out, so to speak. We're going to argue it out. Many people are disturbed when they walk into a yeshiva for the first time because, if you've been to a university library and then you go into yeshiva, they're very different experiences. and besides the cacophony of noise, people are disturbed by the fact that the two people studying together in a chavrusa are typically yelling at each other and telling each other how you're wrong. So what kind of a learning, why all the debate? Why don't we just say this is our tradition and it's passed down through history, etc.? Because if it is l'shem shamayim, if our intention is heavenward, heaven-oriented, then obviously we want to know the truth. And in order to get to the truth, you have to refine the conversation. The way you do that is by asking lots of questions, challenging people's presuppositions, premises, and that's how we eventually get to the truth. So that's one extreme, where people have debates and there's no ego, there's no vested interest whatsoever, they just want to get to the truth. On the opposite extreme, so Hillel and Shammai are going to represent that. And we'll see why in a moment. On the opposite extreme are people who have absolutely no integrity in their argument. They're just rabble-rousers. They want the machloikas. They're not interested in the divine message behind the machloikas. So that would be the other extreme, Korach and his team. What did they want? They just wanted to create division in the community. Now, the thing is that Korach did a really good job of disguising his intentions. Everybody is so holy. I care about the people. I want to make sure that everybody has equal access to God. We don't want to have this hierarchy where a small family of people are the cabal controlling the whole society. So he sounds like he's got these really noble intentions. In the meantime, there's no l'shem shamayim in that. There's none whatsoever. Those are the two extremes of the range. What lies in the middle? What lies in the middle is people who have good intentions and do actually want to arrive at the truth. Along the way, though, they have their own bias. And even though their intention in the long term is to clarify and to get to the MS, but in the actual conversation, that's where it becomes a little bit more personal and a little bit more invested and a little bit more biased. So those are some of the other great Talmidei Chachamim. Even though their argument is l'shem shamayim, the angle they come with in the argument isn't always absolutely pure and objective. Sometimes it's got their premise already built into it. So that's how some of the Meforshim want to explain what's going on over here and why Hillel and Shammai are used as the example. If that is the case, so then what it means when we say that it's sofa lehiskayim, that eventually it's going to endure, or ein sofa lehiskayim, eventually it will not endure. Effectively what we're saying is this: unfortunately there are certain, I don't think we have to delve too deeply to find this, but there are certain controversies that seem to last forever. And they're not l'shem shamayim. I remember once, I may have told you the story before, there was a rabbi who came to South Africa and he was speaking at one of the local shuls and he was telling a story. And in the story, it was about two individuals who had had a falling out. So he says, this rabbi says to a South African audience, he says, so there were these two people and they had a faribel. Do you know what that is? Like we wrote the book on this. So sometimes, a lot of other communities have never heard the word faribel. We're very familiar, unfortunately. So a faribel is a machloikas that seems to last forever. It's passed down generationally, and we don't know why it is, but we don't talk to those people. And you see it even in segments of the Jewish community. There's this community will have nothing to do with that community, etc. So you'd think that it's eventually going to dissipate, right? And it seems just to go on and on and on. So the Mishnah tells us, ein sofa lehiskayim. Eventually there's going to come a time where that debate, that controversy, that division will eventually dissolve. That's guaranteed, because it's not l'shem shamayim, it will eventually dissolve. Whereas if you have a debate that is l'shem shamayim, it is for the sake of heaven, it's not going to disappear. It's going to endure. What does that mean it's going to endure? It means, let's take Hillel and Shammai as an example. So we know that by and large we follow the rulings of Hillel and subsequently of his students of Beis Hillel. That's how it is, by and large. There's certain minor exceptions. There's a very controversial statement in the Gemara that there was a particular day where more of Shammai's students arrived at the Beis Medrash than Hillel's students. The way that we decide the halacha is always by majority. So on that particular day, all of the rulings were in favor of Shammai's teaching. Here's the controversial part. The Gemara says that that day was as difficult for the Jewish community as the day of the breaking of the luchos, right? The day of the making of the golden calf, right? It's quite an incredible thought. So by and large, we know that we follow the opinion of Hillel. Here's the interesting thing. What did the students of Shammai do? So they had their Rebbe who taught a particular way, and his antagonist was Hillel, who taught a different way, and the halacha landed up being like Hillel. What did the students of Shammai do? They followed Hillel. So the interpretation of Sofa Lehiskayim doesn't mean in the end the debate will endure. It means in the end truth will endure because the debate was for the sake of heaven. So therefore it doesn't matter how invested each party was in their views and their opinions. At the end, the truth is going to endure. Not only that, the Gemara tells us a really interesting thing about a debate between Hillel and Shammai. Very interesting. It says that so the debate went back and forth, and there wasn't really clarity on who they should follow. Now, there's a problem with this particular Gemara because we do know as an axiom that you cannot decide halacha based on spiritual intervention. But what's interesting is the insight. The Gemara, I think it's in the beginning of Yevamos, and the Gemara says as follows. Just for context, Yevamos is one of the most complicated Gemaras that you could learn because it speaks about all these different mutations of relationships and how they affect who can marry whom, and if somebody, God forbid, dies without children, what happens to the siblings and the widow, etc. Now, what's important about this is when you come to decide the halacha in these cases, if you decide the halacha and you're not aligned with what the halacha actually is, potentially you produce children who are mamzerim. In other words, if the halacha is that so-and-so may not marry so-and-so, and somebody else has a different view, and they paskin based on their different view and allow them to marry, they could produce mamzerim and vice versa. So there's this massive debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about this particular issue. One of the particular issues called Tzoras Habas. I'm not going to get into the detail, but one of these scenarios that could land up in a situation where, it renders issues of marriage or divorce, which are very serious issues, one way or the other. So the halacha lands up being like Beis Hillel, but here's the chap. Beis Shammai allows their children to marry students of Beis Hillel. In other words, they believe that they have a completely different way of deciding who is or isn't considered marriage material based on these halachas, and in spite of the fact that they have a different view, they allow their children to marry the students of the opposing view because so far lehiskayim, in the end, it's all going to settle. It's all going to, so to speak, come right. So it's in that particular setting where the Gemara tells us that there's a bas kol. There's this heavenly voice. And what the heavenly voice says is fascinating. The heavenly voice says, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim ve'halacha kebeis Hillel. Which means, Eilu ve'eilu, both opinions are 100% the words of the living God. They're 100% valid. It's not that one is a great halachic proposal, but it's invalid. They're both 100% valid. And in practice, the halacha will follow Beis Hillel. That's why Hillel and Shammai are used here as the example of machloikas l'shem shamayim, because look at the endorsement that they have. That Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim, they become the paragon of this principle, that when Torah scholars argue with each other about an issue of halacha, it's not that one version is correct and the other is incorrect, it's that both versions are correct and only one is practical. So let's use Hillel and Shammai as an example. What do we know about Hillel and Shammai? We know that nowadays we pretty much follow Hillel and Beis Hillel in pretty much all halacha. What are we told is going to happen when Mashiach comes? It says when Mashiach comes, the halacha is going to be like Beis Shammai. Now we've got to ask ourselves, why? Why would it change? Isn't one of the principles of our faith, as the Rambam writes clearly in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah and the foundational principles of Torah, HaTorah hazois loi tehei muchlefes. That Torah is not going to change. And if somebody arrives and suggests that a particular halacha in Judaism is no longer relevant, we are required to ostracize them. That's clearly, we just read it in the parasha a couple of weeks ago, Parasha 3a. It's brought in halacha. So how's it possible that we have a particular way of doing Judaism all of the period of the last 2,000 years, and then when Mashiach comes, we're going to start doing it differently? So like, for example, when Mashiach comes, we're going to light the Hanukkah candles differently, because that's one of the classic debates between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, right? Beis Hillel says you light 1 candle on the first night and 2 on the second night, etc. And Beis Shammai says you light 8 on the first night and 7 on the second night, and so you go. So are we now going to change the whole Hanukkah when Mashiach comes? Or are we going to stop celebrating Tu B'Shvat, because the fact that Tu B'Shvat is considered the Rosh Hashanah for trees is Beis Hillel's opinion. But Beis Shammai's opinion is that it's actually Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Or, okay, this one's not so relevant to us because how many people here keep beehives? But there's a whole debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai at which point honeycomb becomes susceptible to become impure. Right? Because honey is one of the 7 liquids that can render something susceptible to impurity. So if it's still in the hive, if it's still in the honeycomb, is it already considered honey or not? According to Beis Shammai it is. According to Beis Hillel, you have to actually start processing the honey or extracting it from the honeycomb before it's considered to be honey. So, and there are many, many other examples, right? But I'm quoting these 3 specifically. So, what does it mean? When Mashiach comes, we're going to suddenly change. So what it means is that Beis Hillel is a valid view for a Galus world, and Shammai is a valid view for a Mashiach world. Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim Chaim, right? Different perspectives of truth, the different applications of truth. So therefore, Sofer L'Yischaim, not only is the truth going to endure, but even the debate is going to endure, meaning to say that there's going to be value to both sides of the debate in the long term, which is a fascinating principle, really fascinating principle. So now we've got to ask ourselves, so how did they get there? What do Hillel and Shammai represent more so than all the other sages that we could have used as examples? Because there are all these classical pairs of sages who debated things throughout the whole of Mishnah and subsequently Gemara. Obviously, we don't expect to quote the Gemara if we're only still at the stage of Mishnah. But even in the Mishnah, there's some classic examples. Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Lozer, Rabbi Yoshua, who tend to debate a lot. You know, so like why Hillel and Shammai? So what we've got to do is this. Let's first understand what sits at the underpinning of the debates of Hillel and Shammai, and then let's understand why they are dafka the best example of collaboration and honesty and integrity in the machlokas space. And then we're going to compare that to Korach and show how Korach is the exact opposite, and that's why he is used as the opposite end of the spectrum. So Hillel and Shammai, let's use that example about Hanukkah. Well, it's an easy example to use. Why do you think it is that according to Beis Hillel, you light 1 candle and you increase each night of Hanukkah, and according to Beis Shammai, you would do the reverse? What do you think lies at the core of their debate?
Well, light goes down and down and down, so Shammai has...
So the Gemara tells us, by the way, that according to Beis Hillel, the principle that we apply is Mailin B'Kodesh, that any time you engage in something which is holy, you're supposed to increase in holiness. And Beis Shammai used the principle of what's called Pirkei Avos, which is the bulls that were brought as offerings during Sukkot, and their numbers diminish over the course of Sukkot. So it wouldn't necessarily be associated with light per se, but then you've got to dig deep and say, so why do we diminish the Pirkei Avos, and why would that apply to Hanukkah? So it's really simple. Beis Hillel, which is the teachings obviously of Hillel himself, say, on day 1, how much Hanukkah do we have on day 1? We have 1 day of Hanukkah. So therefore we light 1 candle. And on day 2, we now have 2 days of Hanukkah, so we can light a 2nd candle, and so it goes. In other words, Hillel takes the perspective that what exists is primary. Shammai says on day one of Hanukkah, how much more Hanukkah is there still to come? So he says, well, there's 8 days of Hanukkah, so we light 8 candles. On the second night of Hanukkah, how much more Hanukkah is there to come? There's only 7 further days of Hanukkah, so you only light 7 candles. In other words, Shammai, and by extension, Beis Shammai, look at the world from the perspective of the potential that still exists. So Hillel is looking from the perspective of the actual reality that we already have achieved, and Shammai looks at the potential of what could still be achieved. Now that's going to apply to all the other examples I gave you as well, because the difference between Rosh Chodesh, Shvat, and Tu B'Shvat has to do with whether or not the water table has already started to absorb into the trees, or if it's just reaching the roots. So Rosh Chodesh, Shvat, the potential for the new growth is there. Tu B'Shvat is when the new growth is actually starting. The same thing with the honeycombs, right? There's the potential to produce honey, so Shammai says you already consider them impure. According to Hillel, you haven't yet produced the honey, so they're not yet a liquid that can contaminate and make things impure.
Is that while Sfiras HaOmer, you also count after?
Okay, Sfiras HaOmer is not debated between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, so let's not mix it into these debates. But what's interesting is that Beis Shammai has the view of potential, and Beis Hillel has the view of actual. So let's go back to one of the famous stories that we know about Hillel and Shammai, which is the story of the potential convert who wants to do yoga while he's learning the whole Torah, right? So he comes to Hillel and he says, teach me the whole Torah first he goes to Shammai and he says, teach me the whole Torah as I stand here on one foot. What does Shammai do with him? He chases him away. That's how everybody's been told the story, right? That he chases him away. But there's a part of the story that nobody thinks about. It says that he chases him away with Amas Abinyan. Amas Abinyan is like, do you remember in school they used to have those big 1 meter long rulers on the blackboard? So that's like an Amas Abinyan. It's a measure that they used, it's an Amma long, and they used it for construction. So he chases him out with this Amas Abinyan. Whereas when he gets to Hillel, so Hillel says to him, this is the whole Torah in 1 foot. What you would hate somebody to do to you, don't do to them. The rest is commentary. Now go and study. So what's the difference between Hillel and Shammai in that particular story? Is that Hillel is saying, let's work with what we have right now. Right now we have a person who's interested. They'd like to know more about Judaism. In their perception, in their limited perception, they believe you can condense the whole of Judaism into a one-liner, into a fridge magnet. So fine, so let's do that for them. But then he says, Zil Gemor, go do something with it. Shammai looks at the potential volume of the whole of Judaism, and he says, sorry, there's no way to compact this. So if you want the zip file, I can't help you. That's why he takes the Amas Abinyan. He says, you got to learn this thing one piece at a time. Amma ba'amma. How do you build a building? One measurement at a time. So I can't just give you the whole thing like this. Now the reason for their two different opinions, Hillel and Shammai, is what we all know. Hillel is a person who was very tolerant and very kind. That story illustrates this point. So Hillel is an icon to represent the world of chesed, the world of kindness and acceptance and tolerance. Whereas Shammai is from the world of justice, gevura. You can actually see it in their names, by the way, because Hillel, we're told, is related to the word that it's very interesting. It's a pasuk. The pasuk says, "Bo halo neiroi," that the light shone forth from his candles. So that's like this extravagance and this sharing. Whereas Shammai is from the Maimer Chazal, Hasham or Choisav, a person who measures every step that they take. So Shammai is from the world of Gevura, where everything is very specific and has to work in a very particular way. And Hillel is from a world where things are quite open and accepting and so on. So therefore, Hillel says the way Judaism should work is, let's look at the reality. The reality of people in our world today is they cannot do Judaism in the most perfect way. So therefore we have to be lenient with them and create halacha that is as inclusive and as lenient as could possibly be. Shammai Behalu Neiroi. So Shammai on the other hand says, but there's a potential of what Judaism is supposed to be. There's an ideal of what Judaism is supposed to be. Let's push people to reach their potential and to live up to the highest standards of Judaism. So therefore, Shammai, and by extension Beis Shammai, always rule in the strictest way possible.
That doesn't take human nature into consideration. While
So Shammai is not taking human nature into consideration.
They'll just fall.
Right, so Shammai has an idealistic view of people's potential, and Hillel has a more pragmatic view of people's nature. But that's only true in our world. In the time of Moshiach, we won't have, right? Hashem's going to remove the distractions and the temptations and all the reasons why we cannot live up to our potential. So therefore, in the time of Moshiach, the appropriate halacha is Shammai's halacha, because that's when we can live the ideal and push ourselves to the highest level. So that's why it's so folly hiskaim. In the end, both sides of the argument will have been fulfilled, will have endured. Now here's the biggest issue. The biggest issue is if you are Hillel and your friend is Shammai, you should not be able to be friends. Because the person who always wants to be inclusive and the person who always demands the highest expectations, generally speaking, can't collaborate. They're absolute opposites. And that's why they're debating halacha, because when Shammai says the halacha should be X, Hillel says, no, we need the halacha to be Y. That's why they're arguing, because they come from completely different worlds. So here's where it gets really interesting. Hashem designed our world with certain things that by definition are in conflict. For example, fire and water. By definition, they're in conflict. So if the environment is on fire, you cannot have water, because if you put water into that environment, you'll kill the fire. So certain things are designed, that's how Hashem made the world, certain things are designed to be in conflict. Now if you had to sit down and interview the shoresh, the spiritual source of fire, and the spiritual source of water, and you had to ask them, what do you stand for? What do you think fire would say? What do you think water would say? What do you stand for?
Water's flowing.
So water would stand for nourishment of life, tranquility, chesed, right? Giving, nurturing, creating pleasure for people, flow, ease, right? And fire would tell you, what do I stand for? I stand for heat and passion and possibly even destruction where necessary. That's what you'd expect them each to say. And we'd be wrong. Because if we would interview the spiritual shoresh, the spiritual source of fire, it would say, I stand for doing what Hashem wants. And if you'd interview the shoresh of water, it would say, I stand for doing what Hashem wants. Okay, what does Hashem want from me? Water wants me to be chesed and flowing and nurturing and whatever. Fire, what does Hashem want of me? It wants me to be passionate and excitable and destructive and hot. And if Hashem wants us to collaborate, what will we do? We'll collaborate. We'll cook, exactly. Or we'll become the plague of hail, right? Where the hail is on fire. Oiseh shalom bimroimav. What does Oiseh shalom bimroimav mean? The Gemara tells us, you have Michael sar shel mayim. Michael is the archangel of water. Gabriel sar shel eish. He's the archangel of fire, and they don't destroy each other, they work in absolute harmony. Because when your positioning statement is l'shem shamayim, then it's not about what I represent. I'm here to serve Hashem. If Hashem needs me, Hillel, to be the voice of chesed and leniency in Judaism, that's what I'm going to do. And if Shammai, Hashem needs me to be the voice of strictness and expectation in Judaism, that's what I'm going to do. But if you need me to do the opposite, we look in Torah and we see that there are scenarios of Kulei base Shammai and Chumrei base Hillel. There are certain scenarios where they switch roles, where base Hillel is the one who rules more strictly than base Shammai. Why? Because the whole machloikas, the only reason that there is a debate is l'shem shamayim. It's not because I am beholden to a particular view and therefore I debate your view, which is different. I'm here to service Hashem. Hashem wants this side of the machloikas, like He wants fire in the world. So that's what I'm going to do. And He wants that side of the machloikas, like He wants water in the world. So that's what I'm going to do. But there's zero vested interest. I'm purely here to serve Hashem. When we're here to serve Hashem, we are capable of crossing over where relevant, where necessary, to argue or propose a halacha in a way that is antithetical to our natural state, because it's not about us. That is sofa lehiskayim. That kind of absolute dedication to Hashem without a personal interest, that kind of position will endure forever. Korach is the exact opposite. Korach is a position where he says, this is how it has to be. There is no scope for the combination, the harmony of different views. It's my way or the highway. Now, Korach is a complicated character because Korach spawns two groups of followers, and they don't necessarily have the same view. In other words, the machloikas of Korach is not only Korach versus Moshe, but within Korach's own camp, there are two separate views. That's why it tells us over here that the example of an inappropriate machloikas is Korach v'chol adosoi. Korach and all of his followers, even though his followers themselves were not all on the same page. How do we know that? Because the way Hashem treats his followers is one group of the followers is burnt by fire after they attempt to bring the Ketores, and the other group of followers are swallowed by the ground. If they're treated in two different ways, that is an indication that they're two different kinds of followers of Korach. They all share the same issue, which is let's undermine the society that Hashem has set up. But the way they approach it is completely different. And we're going to see this hinted at in Korach's name. Korach's name is a Kuf, a Reish, and a Ches. That's Korach's name. Why is that significant? Have a look at these three letters, and you'll be able to tell that all three of these letters are a variation on the theme of another letter, namely the letter Hey. Okay, so a Hey is a healthy letter. A Hey is a letter that represents, and by the way, I'm going to share something that I discovered fairly recently, and it's totally blown my mind. We look at letters in 2D, and we shouldn't. The letters are 3D. So the Hey is a horizontal bar at the top, a vertical bar on the right-hand side, and then the third leg is not cut off, it's three-dimensional. That's the one that's disappearing into the horizon. Okay? So you'll never look at the letters again the same way, right? So we're told that the three components of the letter Hey represent the three components of how we're supposed to connect ourselves to Hashem, which is thought, horizontal bar, speech, the right bar, and action, which is the broken bar. Why is action the broken bar? Because what we think and say doesn't always translate into what we do. In order to be an holistic Jewish person, it's not good enough to float only in the spiritual realms of thought and speech. You actually have to translate your ideals into what you do practically. Korach comes along and he says, this is not realistic. He says, you get spiritual people and you get materialistic people. To expect that we're going to be able to harmonize the two of them is an unrealistic expectation. And that's why you see this odd kind of argument that Korach has against Moshe, because on the one hand he says everybody's holy, which essentially implies that everybody should have equal access even if they're not so spiritual, and then he wants to be the Kohen Gadol. So make up your mind. Is everybody holy or are you special? So, yeah, exactly. Some are equal, some are more equal than others. So Korach's name represents the three corrupted versions of the balance of a Hey. The first version is the Kuf. The Kuf basically is the person who says, look, let's be realistic. We live in a tactile world and all the spiritual stuff is all fine and good, but tachlis, the most important thing is what you do. So if you don't really have the right intentions, you don't really meditate much, you don't really learn much, you don't really daven much, that's okay. As long as you do what's right. In the modern world we call this, the most important thing is to be a mensch. So that's why in the Kuf version, the leg that's supposed to represent action is the one that's exaggerated, because that's the attitude that says just everybody's equal. Doesn't matter. You could be Moshe Rabbeinu, you could be some guy who doesn't know how to read. The bottom line is Moshe puts on tefillin, that guy puts on tefillin. It's all the same. Why is there a hierarchy? We don't need spiritual leadership. We just need everybody to be the same. So that's the kuf of Korach. The people who bought into that part of Korach's argument, they get punished midah keneged midah. What does midah keneged midah mean? Okay, you have no spiritual sustainability, you get swallowed up by the ground, and that's the end of it. You're stuck in the ground, you're stuck in the physicality. You don't actually have an opportunity to rise and to soar and to develop in any meaningful spiritual way. So, ein sofa leiskayim, that kind of an argument has no endurance, because a person who believes that you can have like the Gemara says, mitzvah beloy kavana kaguf beloy neshama, that if you just have the actions and you don't have any meaning behind those actions, the whole experience is actually dead to start with. The opposite is the people who say, no. You have to realize, if there's such a thing as a kohen gadol, well then everybody should be a kohen gadol. Everybody should go into the Holy of Holies. Korach says, I want to be a kohen gadol. Let's not get bogged down in all the minutiae of, like you're going to do this, you're going to do that, whatever. Just have the right intentions, be a spiritual person, hang out in a spiritual environment. Let's get rid of the hay leg. Let's get rid of the action leg and just have the reish, just the part of us that's very spiritual and very connected, and we don't have to translate it into practice. So these are the guys who want to bring Ketoris, because Ketoris is reserved only for the Kohen Gadol, the most spiritual person in the community, who can only bring it on the most spiritual day of the year in the holiest of holies. And the Ketoris was brought daily, but this is the one that eventually goes into the Holy of Holies. It represents the ultimate state of spirituality. So what happens to these people? Hashem says, midah keneged midah. What's going to happen to these people? They're just going to have the neshama sucked out of their bodies. They're going to get burnt to a crisp. Very similar to the Nadav and Avihu kind of an experience, and that's what's going to happen to them. It's machloka she'ein sofa leiskayim. It cannot endure. At the end of the day, this is not a workable solution. It's not a way to live your Judaism. You can't live your Judaism just floating around in a spiritual reality. So what is the objective of Judaism? You've got to have a healthy balance between what you learn, what you meditate on, which includes davening, and what you do in practice. And then you get the ches people who come along and say, oh, so effectively we get it, we understand it. You've got to have this balance in Judaism, right? You've got to have the balance between your spiritual side and your physical side. So then they take away the gap. Take away the gap means that they start to believe that they're all equal. The whole thing, it's all the same, whether you're davening or you're learning or you're doing, it's all the same thing. And that's not Judaism. Judaism is there's got to be a separation. There's got to be some kind of a gap where you recognize that there's a different mode of connection to Hashem through the spirituality of Judaism, and there's a different mode of connection to Hashem through the actions of Judaism. And we shouldn't conflate them all and just make one big cholent and say, well, it's all Judaism, like the people of the Ches wanted to do. So it turns out that Korach is the exact opposite of Hillel and Shammai. Because Hillel and Shammai are quite capable of saying there are different facets of Judaism, extreme facets. Chesed and Gevurah are extreme elements of Judaism. And yet, when you're focused on doing what Hashem wants, that extreme difference doesn't actually get in the way. You can accommodate whatever it is that Hashem needs from you at any given time, whether it is your natural space or something that's unnatural for you. So you're Beis Hillel, and now you've got to make an halachic decision that is strict, and it's outside of your comfort zone. It's okay, because you're doing what Hashem wants. Korach and his team are the exact opposite. They try to modify what Hashem wants to suit the particular bias that they have. So they start twisting the hay. Let's turn it into a kuf. Let's turn it into a reish. Let's turn it into a ches. This Mishnah is teaching us that in order for our Judaism to be sustainable, because that's what this Mishnah is all about, sofa lehiskayim, in order for our Judaism to be sustainable, we do not all have to be homogeneous. We do not all have to share identical views, perspectives, or even what really resonates with us in Judaism. But what we do have to share is that absolute dedication to Hashem. How will we know when we have that dedication? When we're molding ourselves to suit what Hashem wants. How do we know that we have an unsustainable Judaism? When, God forbid, we try to change what Hashem wants to mold into what suits us. So this is an incredibly important Mishnah, right? It's all about me fitting Hashem's goals instead of getting Hashem's goals to suit mine. Or to put it into the cliche that people often use, we can't create God in the image of man. You might remember right at the beginning, what did Hillel teach us? the first perek, he said, Hevemi Talmidav Shal Aaron, you should be a student of Aaron, which is Oyev Shalom V'Roidev Shalom, Oyev Sabrios, you should love peace, pursue peace, love all people. But then he says, Umekarvan La Torah. The real love that you have of somebody is not that you modify Torah to suit them, but you find a way to draw them to come closer to the Torah. It's exactly the same message that we're getting from this mission over here, except possibly here with a little bit more detail, that the ultimate goal is to get us to align with Hashem. Sofer L'Iskai, and that's an enduring Judaism. And anytime we try and twist Judaism to suit an agenda, ain't Sofer L'Iskai. It can't work.
Wow.